Ukraine stands strong against the forces of the Russian invasion. Lieutenant General Mykola Oleshchuk, commander of the Air Force of Ukraine, said that since September, Ukraine has destroyed more than 650 Russian cruise missiles and 610 Iranian drones, reports Ukrainska Pravda. Oleshchuk added in an interview with Army Inform that the Air Force received anti-aircraft missile systems from Western partners, among them NASAM's Iris-T, Krotal, Gepard, and are currently waiting for Patriot and SAMP-T. However, he noted this help is not enough. Ukraine needs modern multi-purpose planes and anti-aircraft missile systems. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the participants of the event of the Federal President of Germany dedicated to solidarity with Ukraine and said that Russian troops currently occupy 1,877 Ukrainian cities and villages, reports Rubrika. Zelensky noted that more than 90% of Mariupol, which is occupied by Russia, has been destroyed and there are almost no houses left intact. He stressed that Ukraine is fighting for basic security, freedom, life under the law, human dignity and happiness. And one of the strategic goals will be an attempt to divide the Russian forces in the south, reports Deutsche Welle. Effectively, it means that Ukraine will try to get to the Azov Sea and divide Russian grouping between Crimea and the mainland of Russia. According to Skibitsky, the specific time of the offensive depends on a number of factors, including the supply of Western weapons. He does not rule out that Ukraine will strike on armed warehouses on Russian territory, as they are used for attacks on Ukraine. The deputy head of military intelligence stressed that Ukraine will stop only when it restores the country in the borders of 1991, including Crimea. The countries of the European Union agreed to the 10th package of sanctions against Russia, reports European Pravda. They cover exports worth 11.4 billion euros and include restrictions on sensitive dual-use technologies and advanced technologies that contribute to Russia's military capabilities and technological advancements. The restrictions include electronic components used in Russian weapons systems, drones, missiles, helicopters, other vehicles, as well as bans on specific rare elements and military thermal imaging devices. In addition, 96 organizations linked to the Russian military-industrial complex were added to the sanctions list. For the first time, 7 Iranian organizations that use EU components and provide Russia with military drones used in the attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine are included in the list as well. Additional export bans are also imposed on goods that can be used in support of Russian military operations. Among them are heavy trucks, electric generators, binoculars, radars, compasses, goods used in the aviation industry. 3 Russian banks have been added to the list of entities subject to the freezing of assets and the ban on providing funds and economic resources. The new package of sanctions also prohibits Russian citizens from joining the management bodies of critical infrastructure companies of EU member states. Sanctions are also imposed against 121 individuals and legal entities. Among them are persons responsible for the deportation of Ukrainian children, as well as manufacturers of weapons and persons who contribute to the evasion of sanctions. The President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, welcomed the new sanctions but stressed that they should also be imposed against the Russian nuclear industry and all those involved in the missile program. The UK government is to allocate almost 3,000 Eurovision Song Contest tickets to Ukrainians who were forced to leave their homes due to the war.
Okay, guys, 1 year of war in Ukraine. It's official. Yeah, yesterday, February 24th. And I thought I would just do a few small stories, but just a little bit of a recap and what's gone on so far. Remember, this is called, from the Kremlin's point of view, this is called the, quote, special military operation, end quote. And now this is the biggest ground war in Europe since World War II. We're bogged down in a World War I style trench and artillery war. And the Western estimates now of Russian casualties are around 200,000 killed or wounded in one fucking year. That is I can't even wrap my head around it. And the thing is, if you look at polls, I know the suspect, but I discount polls, but I go on chat boards and some Telegram channels, and the people of Russia support this. Like, can you imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans were getting killed or wounded in Afghanistan after 12 months? They'd be fucking carrying the president out of the fucking White House nude and burning the place down. But nobody's got any fucking balls in Russia. Like I said before, it's time to somebody just take Putin out, dude. That's the only way it's going to do. So then, so basically the quick push raced across the border, and then they went after Kiev. Moscow, remember, attempted to seize the capital of Ukraine in the early days of the war. And while the Russians were focused on the eastern part of Ukraine, those two regions we've talked about a lot, the Ukrainians made the Russians pay. Indeed, they actually pushed Russia out of large chunks in the northeast, east, and south. Putin had to order a call-up of 300,000 soldiers last fall. That led a lot of young people to fucking flee the country and all that shit. Now, remember, what were the roots of this? That's the important thing. How did we get here? Well, you remember after the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, NATO expanded eastward, and they eventually took in most of the European nations that had been in what they call the communist sphere. That is, they are not themselves Soviet socialist republics, but they're on the border, like Poland, right? Poland was not part of the Soviet Union, but it was like under their influence. And parts of the Soviet Union, actual parts of the Soviet Union, notably Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, they joined NATO. By the way, it's North Atlantic Treaty Organization if you're dense and don't know anything. As did Poland, as did Romania, and more. And that put NATO hundreds of miles closer to Moscow. Then in 2008, NATO leaders said they planned one day to enroll Ukraine, although at the time that still seemed like a far-off prospect because Ukraine was still so corrupt. Now, Putin, remember, has described the Soviet Union disintegration as one of the greatest catastrophes of the 20th century. He feels that robbed Russia of their rightful place among the world's great powers. So that's been his fucking dream. Rebuild Russian military. Rebuild their clout. Now, Vladimir Putin it's hard to get a read on exactly what he believes, but supposedly he liked the Soviet Union for the power and the projection they had. He wasn't like a hardcore communist. Like, he's not like this one of these Marxist Leninist, freaks who thinks that we should bring back the tractor factory days. Like, he doesn't believe in that so much. He just wants the power and the land. So once NATO expansion started coming, and once he heard about the prospect of Ukraine joining it, he was like, hell no. And he said, I'm just not going to have it. And he insists that Ukraine is fundamentally part of Russia, culturally and historically. Now, there is huge evidence to the contrary of that. Most Ukrainians would laugh at that, including my ancestors. And then East and West relations got bad, really bad, in early 2014 when those mass protests in Ukraine forced out that president who is closely allied with Vladimir Putin. So then, as payback, Russia quickly invaded and then annexed Crimea. That was part of Ukraine, and it's a huge strategic importance because it's right there on the Black Sea. The Russian fucking Navy was parked out there. And then Moscow also armed and reinforced those separatist rebellions that took control in that Donbass region in Ukraine. Remember, that little war, that rebellion, that had already killed more than 13,000 people in a few years, and that was before the invasion last year even started. So, yeah. Remember, Putin is 70 years old, and he wants Ukraine. That's a nation of 44 million people. Months before invading in December of 2021, Russia presented NATO and the U.S. with a set of written demands that it said were needed to ensure its security. The West was never going to meet any of these. One of the big ones was a guarantee that Ukraine never join NATO and that NATO draw down their forces in the Eastern European countries that had already joined. So we didn't like that. And remember, Ukraine is not a member of the NATO alliance, so it doesn't fall under our purview. That treaty we have, which says if one NATO country comes under attack, you must respond. Like if Poland was invaded, right? We'd have bombers and fighter jets and the whole might of the U.S. military would be over there. But since Ukraine is not one, we don't have to do that. But we did have decided, the government, for better or for worse, that we cannot have Vladimir Putin taking control of Ukraine and decide to do something about it. Now, I really can see both sides. I don't like to fence it that much. I fence it a little bit on this because I can see both sides. I can see the side that says, why are we spending all this fucking money in Ukraine? Most people didn't even know what I'm half Ukrainian. Most people didn't know what Ukraine was 2 years ago. Why are we spending all this money when we've got our own problems and blah, blah, blah? I get it. But then you look at other people like, dude, we have destroyed half of Russia's tanks and like hundreds of thousands of their troops for a kind of a bargain. I get that argument as well because it really has been a bargain. But then it's like, why is this our business? And now Russia and Ukraine, there's no sign of stopping. It's a fucking meat grinder. You know, I don't even like those videos. I think I might have said this last week, but I see a lot of those videos and it's set to cool music and shit on Instagram of just guys getting blown up and mutilated. You know what? I don't even want to watch them anymore because this is like a fucking humanity tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of young people just fucking blown to shit in two advanced countries, you know? It's crazy. So I have a few stories here I thought you'd find relevant. How about the money? What have we spent? Well, they had a breakdown a little bit. I thought might as well go through it quickly. We have spent $113 billion on Ukraine. That is far more than we've spent on any other nation, obviously. 46.6 billion of that is in military assistance. Okay, the rest of it is for like their economy and everything else. The last time we gave any European country this kind of financial backing was post World War II. This is a useful thing. Remember, right after World War II, you guys have heard the term the Marshall Plan. That was when we decided we had to rebuild Europe post-World War II to fight off Stalin, who was still itching to like maybe take over some countries. So we instituted the Marshall Plan and we decided to rebuild it. At the time, it was $13 billion was the Marshall Plan. That would be worth about $160 billion in today's money. So some of here's the $46 billion in military aid. Here's some of what we sent. 8,400 javelins. One Patriot missile defense battery, 31 M1 Abrams tanks, 1,700 Humvees, 38 HIMARS rocket systems, 109 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 15 Mi-17 helicopters, 1,800 Phoenix Ghost drones, 700 Switchblade UAVs, and obviously that's just there's much more in small arms and everything else. We are by far the largest donors of military aid to Ukraine. The U.S., as I said, $46.6 billion. The next closest in military aid is the U.K. with $5 billion. Now, again, because of the war, obviously, Ukraine is far and away the top of other recipients of U.S. military aid. Just to let you know, the $46.6 billion at the top, who else is the next highest recipient of military aid? That would be, you guys probably can guess, Israel. $3.3 billion a year. How about the next one? Any guesses? It would be Afghanistan, $2.8 billion. Then Egypt at $1.3 billion. Iraq is all the way down to $500 million. Not that much, I guess. Yep. So, and the financial assistance we've given them is $26.4 billion, and then the rest is like humanitarian shit. And we also, that far exceeds. So you take the total amount, okay, that whole 113 billion. That's the total amount, right? The next highest total amount is the entire European Union or the EU government at 29.7 billion. So we're way far ahead of it. And I don't know, like that's part of my gripe too. It's like, why isn't Europe kicking in more? This is your fucking problem, kind of. Now we're kicking it up with China, and now this is back to like current events, right? So China wants to stay friends with Russia, and they claim they want to talk Russia and Ukraine into peace talks. So the U.S. came out this week and claimed that Beijing may be poised to send, quote, lethal support, end quote, to help Russia's war in Ukraine. Well, China was like, well, what the fuck are you doing? Which is true. We're doing the same thing. So, we don't really have much to stand on there. But the country of China's leader, Xi Jinping, clearly is trying to keep Russia close, but he doesn't want to completely sever ties with us either. And he's, like I said, hey, I'm just trying to be a peacemaker here. But over the weekend, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken indicated that he had evidence that behind the scenes, Beijing was tilting towards stronger support for Putin. And he's the one who said, quote, considering providing lethal support to Russia in its aggression against Ukraine, end quote. So that would be a big deal if China did that, because they've defended their economic and energy ties and all that, but they have not supplied it with weapons or battlefield equipment. And Blinken said he'd warned his Chinese counterpart that there would be serious consequences were that to occur. I mean, that's kind of ballsy of us, isn't it? Yeah, here you go. Asked about the accusations, the spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Wang Wenbin, suggested that, on the contrary, it was the United States that was implicated in bloodshed in Ukraine. He said at a news conference, did Wang, quote, it's the U.S. and not China that has been incessantly supplying weapons to the battlefield, and that the U.S. is not qualified to issue any orders to China, end quote. Yeah. But so they're not happy at us because of our hypocrisy. Now, meanwhile, China, by the way, is supposed to welcome the Belarusian leader over concerns about Ukraine. You guys remember this name? That would be the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. You guys remember his name? He's been around a bit. Now, the president of Belarus is a staunch Kremlin ally, and they're going to have a state visit in China. And they just announced this today, Saturday. So it's supposed to be 3 days. Remember, Lukashenko allowed Russian forces to use his country as a staging ground for that invasion of Ukraine. So pretty good timing here. And I wonder what's going to happen. Because Lukashenko has stopped short of supporting it. Like, he's allowed Russians to, like, cross over his land, but he has not been, like, sending his military in. And then, of course, Biden went to Kiev. Sleepy Joe, he made it over there. Everybody was very excited. Oh, God. Old Sleepy Joe. I'm looking at a picture of him there right now. Yep. Hey, credit where it's due. He did go over there, and it was like the, he was in a combat. It is dangerous. This is in Afghanistan where you're pretty safe on a base. They could fucking always lob some missile over there. But yeah, the security, I have a story on this I'll get to in a second, but the security was insane. All of central Kiev was completely locked down. The streets were closed to cars, no pedestrians. And when they started doing that, obviously everybody's like, well, something big is happening. Like, somebody big is coming. So then Biden showed up and they walked around Kiev. So I don't know what that'll do. But the media went fucking ballistic. Oh my God, they were jizzing themselves. As a matter of fact, I have a audio supercut for you, and you'll hear a variety of media outlets going, this is orgasmic. Let's listen to it.
Joe Biden has put solidarity ahead of his own personal safety.
Air raid sirens and no real guarantee of security.
As air raid sirens blared.
This was incredibly dramatic, Andrea. It was historic as well.
Historic, timely, and brave.
The first American president to go to a war zone with no U.S. military presence for security on the ground.
American presidents have made dramatic trips before. Nixon to China, Kennedy, Reagan to the Berlin Wall, and presidents have visited U.S. troops in war zones, but never like this.
To find a day of this kind of presidential bravery in a war zone, you've got to go all the way back to 1864.
With Biden's trip to Europe, he is welcomed as not only frankly the savior of Ukraine, but also the savior of Europe as a whole.
It's historic. It's the first time that a U.S. president has gone into an active war zone that the U.S. military does not have control over.
And against all odds, it was successful.
The continuing threat quite literally sounding all around the two leaders.
The skies here are not safe, and in fact, an air raid siren went off while President Biden was here.
Seeing the American president there, walking the streets of Kyiv while air raid sirens literally sounded in that moment about possible incoming fire from Russia.
The wail of an air raid siren.
Air raid sirens wailing in the background.
Seemingly undeterred by an air raid siren.
Undeterred.
I do think that was
of
bullshit.
air sirens.
President Biden's ability with his aviators on to walk through in broad daylight in Kyiv.
The swagger